Brothers and sisters, today brings us to the Sunday of the Samaritan Woman, where we find Jesus on a long journey who sits at a place called Jacob's Well, which was a place in Samaria. Now, Jesus was traveling through, and that was pretty much the only time that you would see Jews in Samaria, willingly at least. Samaritans were considered to be tainted cousins, almost half-breeds. It was a place that any pious Jew would only travel through. They wouldn't stop longer than they absolutely had to. They wouldn't talk to anyone from the area. They wouldn't have anything to do with the place beyond their footprints. So he sits down at the 6th hour, which is around midday, and he immediately sets about breaking taboos. Jesus had the standing of a pious Jewish rabbi, in addition to, of course, being a Jewish male. So he had a race taboo when he spoke to the Samaritan woman. He had a gender taboo, speaking with a woman. And as we would find out, he even had a purity taboo, speaking with someone who may have been an adulterator or a fornicator. She would have been somewhat of an outcast in her own community even. Altogether, this many taboos at once, you would think it unthinkable that someone would bridge all of those taboos. But that is precisely what Jesus did. He asked for a drink, which is a really logical request in the middle of a desert. She replies, "Who are you to break these taboos? Who are you to talk to me?" And he immediately sets about turning her attention to something higher. He displays prophecy very soon after, knowing about her marital status and her past history. And by this, he reveals to her that he's not an ordinary man, that he is at least in contact with God, which is what it is to be a prophet. And she accepts this. She accepts that he's a prophet and asks him a deep theological question. And she gets an answer. It's not one that she likes, but she gets an answer. That salvation, yes, is from the Jews, but soon it's not going to matter because worship will be done everywhere. And she doesn't like that answer, and so she appeals to the Samaritan concept of the Savior. The Samaritan concept of Messiah is one who was a teacher, one who would come in to teach us all things. That's what their Messiah was. Not the political leader that the Jews were waiting for, but a teacher. And this is the title that Christ claims. He claims that he is as well the Samaritan Messiah. The woman drops everything, including the water jug that had 10 seconds ago been so precious. And she goes to the city and talks to people about her experience so that they can see it for themselves. Meanwhile, the disciples try to get Jesus to eat. It's a really common theme in the Gospels that they are so busy that they don't have time to sit down and eat a meal together. For the simple reason that wasn't their priority. Higher than their priority for even basic human nourishment was the gospel. Higher than their priority for food was connection with God and sharing that with people around them. He redirects their attention to these Samaritans who are coming from the city like a white field ready for harvest. And the Samaritans there encountered Christ for themselves. No longer did they have to believe only on the strength, only on the word that the woman herself said. But rather, they were able to believe for themselves because of what they experienced in their encounter with Christ. So there's two big things that we can learn from today's reading. The first thing that we can learn and that we can put into practice is what we as Christians are to do. To show love for all, including those outside of our us group, whether that's race or class or gender or creed or whatever the case may be. Our deal, because we follow Christ, is to show love to all. And that word love has a particular meaning in our own context. That word love is to be self-emptying, to be self-sacrificial in our love to others. It doesn't just mean acquiescence, to agree with the other, to say that the other is right, to accept everything that another person does. It does mean to sacrifice oneself for them. That's what it is to have love in our own context as Christians. It tells us to reach out to those who are outcasts in particular. There was a person who did a survey of all of Jesus' interactions in the Gospels. I forget exactly how many they come up with, but there were hundreds, which tells you where Jesus put himself. He put himself in places where he could interact with people, where he could interact with those who were on the inside and those who were on the out, those who are us and those who are them, with everything that implies. And if you put them together, if you put them along the graph of positive and negative and of insiders and outsiders, in the quadrant with positive interactions with outsiders, over half of the interactions that Jesus had in the Gospels were in this one quadrant. Positive interactions with those who were on the outside, not those who were on the inside. Over half were there, and that tells us something. The predominance of that tells us something. That we too ought to have interactions with those on the outer. That we shouldn't be driving away. That as much as possible, we should be welcoming, and that absolutely we should be showing Christ's love to everyone, including those on the outer. We see that the gospel knows no bounds, and that's reflected in today's epistle. There were people that were dispersed from Jerusalem because of a persecution that arose around the time when St. Stephen was martyred. And because this was their understanding at the time, they were sharing the gospel only with those who had been prepared for thousands of years. That is, those who were Jewish, those who were attending synagogues. And yet, only 3 chapters later, we find, after a lot of tension, a lot of arguments about this, we find that that matter had changed entirely. That the gospel was open to all. That the gospel didn't know racial boundaries. That it didn't ask you to be a race before being Christian. But that instead, everyone was able to follow Christ. And yet, that breaking barriers, that showing love to all, we see that Christ still retained truth. That truth was still so important to him that in his interaction with the Samaritan woman that we heard today, he still said the truth. Yes, salvation is of the Jews. It wasn't what she wanted to hear, but it was still truth. And that's why it was necessary to say that. He was asked a direct question and he needed to respond in truth. Because love means truth too. It doesn't just mean getting praise or wanting a false peace. But it means truth as well. Truth bundled up with self-sacrificial love. The other thing, brothers and sisters, that we learn from today is from the reaction to the encounter that Christ had with the Samaritan woman. How is it that people responded to this encounter? We see their priorities, the priorities of the Samaritan woman. She dropped her water jug in order to share the gospel. Not to hear, but to share. To say to the other people in the city, is this the one that we've been waiting for? I'm not sure. Is it? Come and see. Dropped everything to share. She brought friends to encounter Christ. Because if it's that important, if it's the fulfillment of thousands of years of prophecy, if it's the fulfillment of our life, it's the fulfillment of that hole that everyone has inside of them, if it's that important to us, it's going to be that important to people around us as well. Perhaps not to all, but certainly to some. And lastly, we see the stages of belief that people went through. We saw the Samaritan woman turn from disbelief to curiosity to belief and sharing. And we saw those in her city turn from curiosity, belief because of what she said, and then belief because of their own experience. This teaches us how we grow in our life. And certainly we have experienced this ourselves. Living a Christian life means that we start from perhaps afar off, looking distantly. Then we grow in our development. We learn to pray. We learn to give. We learn to give of ourselves. We learn to give up things for the sake of God. And hopefully we grow on this as time goes by. And in the same way that they came to belief through stages, just as in the same way that we'll hear the same thing next week, that belief in stages, not being totally ready for everything at once, but eventually getting there, so too is that in our own lives. So brothers and sisters, if we learn from today's reading, let us learn to show that love to everyone and to respond to the encounter with Christ with all the urgency and all the sincerity that such a thing would necessitate. Amen.